buffering is something that maybe you've come across as a concept that's mentioned as a good thing. If you're at all responsible as a leader, I'm sure you've tried to learn a bit about how to be a better leader, probably while you're watching this video. However, some sort of common advice that I see too much mentioned is the fact that a good leader has to form a buffer around the team. Maybe you've read that advice as being an abstraction layer, being a protector, being a guardian, a gatekeeper, whatever. Because your team is a bunch of precious snowflakes who ought not be disturbed. If they will find out what's going on outside of the real world, they'll be too worried, they won't be able to function, they'll be doing things that are not in their core and therefore will not be productive. And it is up to you, the leader, to protect them from all of that. And at first, that, I'm guessing, makes sense. I will admit that to me, that made sense. I'm guessing if you dig a few of my older articles from years ago, you'll see me echoing a bit of the same concept about the role of a good leader. And with time, I realized that that is a complete mistake. When you view yourself as a buffer, you're setting your team to fail. And if there's one thing that I know as a geek and past hacker, the only good thing about buffers is finding how you can make them overflow to exploit it. And I don't think that's what you want to end up seeing. Because, well, the concept of being a leader and buffering seems to come from this sort of thinking that our team is only good at whatever that specific individual contributor's role is and not the things that are going on outside. So we have to make sure that we chew on every task just enough to give it to them. We have to ensure that worrying news don't reach them, or we have to spin them a bit so when they reach the team is not too worried. I actually talked recently to a co-founder of a startup who told me about this thinking. Should we be clear to our founding team? We're talking about the first 5 to 10 people who joined a tiny startup, not people who joined IBM and are worried about its latest financial report. We're talking about people who willingly, consciously decided to go and join a very tiny startup. And the founder was thinking, should we be telling them the truth about how close we are to product market fit or not, about whether we're moving as fast as we wanted to or not? And this is a great example of buffering. You're thinking, I need to shield my team from this worrying scenario, the fact that startups are not easy. And if you do that, you might spare some of their extra brain cycles for a couple of months, but eventually, you know what's going to happen? Eventually, they will realize what's happening. I'm assuming you didn't hire people who are not smart, right? And therefore, there's only so long that you can fool them. You can call it buffering, but you're essentially fooling them, hiding things from them. It's like me trying to hide some bad news from my kids. I can only do it so long, but after a month or so, they have realized that there are hostages taken here in Israel, and I can no longer shield them from that. I have to communicate it to them, but I can no longer pretend that didn't happen. There was only so long that I was able to keep them in that bubble. And you should not aim to do that with adults if you can't do it with kids. And let's add to that the fact that whenever you do this buffering, this shielding, there are 3 issues that you're creating. One is, the coddling of the engineering mind. When you act as a buffer, you're taking away from them their agency, their autonomy, their capacity to do things at the highest level they can because you've decided to put them inside this sandbox. And of course, they cannot be privy to all of the company's financial details and how much salary each one is getting. That's fine. But I'm guessing we can agree that there's quite a gap here between letting them know that everything's fine and hiding a bunch of information from them to giving them access to the company's bank account. We can find the middle road here that allows them to have enough autonomy to actually shine. And if you don't do that, you're kneecapping them. You're becoming de facto. You're saying, here, I want to be a bottleneck. I found the bottleneck, this buffer I'm thinking about, and I'm going to wedge myself right in there so my team cannot do anything without relying on me, because I have become their connection to the outside world. That's what a buffer is. You're there between two things, and all communication has to go through you for people to be able to work. That's a bad thing. Further, I'm guessing if you've been into leadership for a while, whether as a senior leader or the managers you have under you, you're used to hearing managers continuously say how much they are overwhelmed. You're always too busy. There are not enough hours in the day. Your calendar looks like a poor game of Tetris. You're constantly rushing from one meeting to the next, from one Zoom to the next Google Meet, and when you want to take a bio break, you have to schedule it. So, a big part of that is this thinking that we have to be these buffers, these routers, these abstraction layers, because what it means is that too much of the communication going on in an organization has to channel through you. That's not what you want to do. You want to ensure that you're there, you are present, but you are not the pipe to the outside world for them. You are not the only interface that they have in order to communicate internally and externally. And lastly, this also contributes to this state where your best people are not aware of what is actually going on. And when this eventually stops being true, they find out something, maybe because you had to break the news to them, maybe they got some rumors, maybe someone is sensing that something doesn't make sense, you're going to see that you're going to have incredible trust issues, because once I realize that you're hiding information from me, how will I trust you? I'm going to always second guess whether what you're saying is true. Recently, a CTO told me about his plan for succession planning, and a major part of that was, am I going to make a lot of people realize that this was at play for months without being honest about this or not? And how am I going to handle this? And this is something that's real. You have to consider, how will you do things in a way that finds the balance between how much you can say and when eventually people find out, how hard are they going to take the fact that, oh, this isn't something that I was allowed to know prior. So, taking all that into account, how can you stop being a buffer and start creating things, creating a culture that makes more sense for you and for your team? If you've been following, I always have a notebook handy because that's the only way my brain functions. And so, what should you be doing instead of being this buffer? I think I've gone through a lot of my writing, a lot of the summaries that I have from sessions with my clients to see what do I see that's actually working in the real world, and not just provide you with some theoretic opinion. And what I think works best is deciding to be as transparent as you can. And whenever you have to share information that you think is going to be tough or not easy to digest, your role is not to sugarcoat everything. Your role is to help them have the tools to understand the situation better. Sometimes that means, for example, when raising funds takes longer, don't just say, yeah, raising funds is taking longer than we expected. Try and help them see why that is. Maybe it's the entire economy, not just your specific startup. Help them see what others are going through so they get the tools. That's not buffering because you're not standing between them and the real world. That's helping them understand things better. Next, knock it out with feeling like you have to be right there in the middle of every sort of communication. And when I debug this with my clients, sometimes just this thinking, this is my role. And if you can just stop that, that's fine. But a major issue of why we jam ourselves in the middle and call it buffering, call it shielding, or being an obstruction layer, is that at the bottom of it, really, if you keep asking why, we do not trust our people enough to do this. And therefore, I completely agree. If you don't trust people, you shouldn't just say, no, the principle is that I don't need to be buffering, so I'm just going to let them do the work without being involved, knowing it's not going to work. That's not what leadership is about. However, what we tend to do is make all the decisions and then relay to people. That doesn't allow them to grow. That's creating a codependency. And sometimes what we do is we say, okay, let's shadow. You look at what I'm doing and you learn from that. That type of shadowing is still you buffering, just have someone nearby. I prefer to try and do things the other way around. If you don't trust people completely, and we're not talking about areas where every second counts, let your people make the decisions. You can shadow them. You can be there in the meetings with them, see what they're deciding, see what their thinking is, and then help them. This is like a very good coach, sitting side by side, seeing your decisions and helping you as you're making the decisions with some thinking, with some questions. You see that they're going in a certain direction, you can try and say, but what about this? And what would you do if this happens? And with time, I'm hoping your questions, as you see them grow, and as you see that they start being more independent, have the skills needed, and need less of your coaching there, you will not need to buffer and shield and ask questions that are completely leading questions, like, but what about this scenario where you have to do this and that? But you'll be able to say, and what will you do if this happens, or what do you think might go wrong here, and what about the timelines? And you just ask a few questions to make sure that they're thinking about things and not missing anything that to you seems obvious. And with time, that shadowing can turn into you not being there present, you're just involved in general. You can be contacted when they need you. You can be looped in, but you don't have to be the loop. And this is what we want to see. Once we break that, you will be able to start disengaging from this day-to-day router mode where you're relaying messages left and right, where you're making these translations and passing the information, but you'll be able to finally become a real leader, operate at a different altitude, and do some things that are a lot more impactful, which I'm guessing we're going to be covering in some future videos very soon. So if you found this interesting at all, do let me know in the comments and subscribe to this channel so you're going to get the next one. Remember, we don't like buffer overflows. We don't like YouTube buffering. Buffers are not good. Don't be one.